The Mototec 48v Pro is still here. No, I haven't abandoned it yet. But we'll have to see whether or not that stays true by the end of this video. I know it's been a while since we've seen this bike, thanks to the tuning of it, as well as other things like other bike projects and continued supply chain delays, especially with third parties. You know who you are. All of that honestly left me a little discouraged when it came to this bike, so it's been off to the side ever since. But since then, I've gotten some very helpful suggestions from you, the audience, which I think we're gonna try today. So when we plugged in a fardriver controller and tuned it using the app, it solved a lot of problems that the stock configuration had. It is much smoother now, and it's a lot faster, but it has a dead spot in the RPM that has been the bane of my existence. At roughly 2500 RPM, this bike goes from smooth as silk to the feeling of grinding concrete. It sounds bad, it feels bad, and despite everything that I've tried with this bike so far, it won't go away. But today we have a few things to try and to try again, which we're gonna start with, that being chain tension. We're starting with the easiest thing and something that is not electronically related. I also highly doubt that this is going to be my issue, but having improper chain tension can cause an undesirable feel to the drivetrain. So if it's too loose, it can feel too rattly, and if it's too tight, it's gonna add added strain on the motor. So we're gonna retension this chain again, and we'll loosen the axle, slide the rear wheel back with the adjusters to the point where the chain is fairly tight, but it still has a little bit of play up and down.
Well, it feels nice and tight, but now the ultimate test. There's that judder right where I left it, unfortunately.
Yeah, that definitely wasn't it. And I think the reason why is because the motor's actually mounted on the swing arm in this case instead of inside the frame. Yes, you should still have this properly tensioned, but the chain tension itself is not going to be influenced at all by the movement of the swing arm or the compression of the suspension. It's going to stay the same. Now, if the motor was mounted in the chassis, that would be a different story. So the problem is with the electronics. And before we start looking at the actual physical connections of those electronic components, let's first look at a couple of small parameter changes.
First parameter change on the table today. While I don't think this is going to have any impact whatsoever, someone put a very lengthy comment and provided a lot of information, so I figured I would give this a shot anyway. And that change is to the max phase current, which is the torque. So I had upped that previously at 220 amps because I had it safely at like 100, but then I learned that that's more on a torque figure, not for over boosting it really. And they suggested that since this controller is set up to be 300 boost, that you just set it to 300 amps. So this is at 300 amps. I don't feel any major changes from that. It feels the exact same as it did 5 minutes ago. But the most important feeling, which right there, still juddery. Another parameter that people have brought up, and I mentioned this when I was trying to diagnose this in the first place, which is the AN setting. I still don't 100% know what that is. It has something to do with the type of motor that you have, but someone mentioned that yes, the range is from 0 to 16, and this one is definitely on the 0 range, but you can at least update it one number at a time up to 4. So right now I have the AN fit to 1, and we're gonna see if that has any change to things. So far, all I can feel is that it's a little slower on the acceleration, but besides that, it's the same. Hey, look at this. Wide open. Okay, now we're up to 4. Right there. Yep, there's our favorite dead spot. It is still very prevalent. Oh yeah, that setting I should not have messed with whatsoever. We're back from 4 down to 0, and it is so much peppier. Still that dead spot though. That's gonna haunt me for the rest of eternity.
One very popular topic that came up was something called cogging, and I'll try to explain what cogging is as best as I could read and understand it. From what I gather, cogging is where the controller doesn't actually know where the motor is in its relative position, and it gives a very rough response. This is especially at low RPM where the motor's not spinning fast enough to give data to the controller so it knows what to do. Now, this is more common in something with sensorless motors like RC cars, but you can have certain parameters set where it is noticed in the Mototec. Back when I was originally tuning this fardriver and I didn't quite know what I was doing, I was adjusting things like phase offset rather than 1 or 2 numbers at a time, adjusting them 20 plus numbers at a time. And I got so far off from the phase offset that at some points when I gave it any throttle input whatsoever, it would just give a horrible clicking noise and wouldn't move at all. But in this instance, I don't think what I'm experiencing is actually cogging. It's actually really good at low RPM. It's just one specific point in the RPM range, and everything above and below is perfectly fine. So while it's an interesting thought, I think I've already done everything that I can on that front. But what about other controller inputs besides just the motor? The only way to tell it to go to that RPM is with the throttle, so maybe it's the throttle. When I switched the controller, I also switched the throttle, and honestly, this is a very cheap throttle. It was from Amazon after all, so it could have a dead spot in it.
So I've been saying that this is an RPM issue because it happens roughly at the same RPM, but maybe it's not. Maybe it is a throttle position issue. So I think a way to test that is to see if we can get to that rough spot at different throttle positions, whether or not we slowly build up to it, or if we go over it and then ramp down, does it happen at the same throttle position? Okay, so ramping up, it's right about here, and wow, that's almost no throttle at all. I'm just barely moving my wrist. And then if we just full throttle it, there it is. It actually does feel like it's in the same position, give or take. It's like barely off throttle.
You can adjust the throttle voltages at which this works in the fardriver app as well. This throttle typically works from about 1 volt on the low end up to 4 volts on the high end. The auto learn process actually does a good job of putting that range together for you, but you can fine tune that, which I have done already. What we could also try is another throttle, one that works. We know that the stock one, while the acceleration was a little abrupt, that's probably more to do with the controller, and that throttle didn't have any dead spots in it. So now the question is, if we put this one in, is it any better? All right, this looks a little weird, but it should work. So I still have the old one because it needs the key so I can turn it on, but I just connected the 3 wires from the stock one. So this button does nothing. This probably won't go on, but at least I can turn it. It'll beep, and it works. All right, let's give this a shake.
So far so good, actually. Nope, I spoke too soon. There it is. It's a little different on this throttle, but it could just be the differences between the two. Still prevalent.
Looks like we're running out of possible culprits on this one. If the drivetrain's good, if the parameters are good, and if the throttle is good, it's looking like I got a dud of a controller. But I think there's one more thing I can do and eliminate one more item, however unlikely that is, and that being the motor. And I'm gonna do that by just putting it back to 100% stock and getting rid of that fardriver entirely. Now, if I run that in 100% stock and it still has a rough spot, then we know for sure it is the motor. But if it runs perfectly, which I suspect it will, it's gonna be the controller for sure.
Here's a quick time lapse, ripping out the fardriver. Maybe it'll be scraps if the stock controller is a thriver. Let's see how it runs.
Yeah, it works. Shocker.
Well, it's exactly as I suspected. It's the controller, and I'm gonna blame the hardware this time, not the software, because I've made every tweak possible to make this thing run as perfect as it should, and it should run that way. I've reached out to experts, I've listened to your suggestions as well, and nothing is making a difference. It's bound to happen to some, I suppose. These are very cheap units, so I don't think quality control is exactly its best feature, so I just got unlucky here. So, where does that leave us? There's a couple of options here. First one, of course, is to just leave it stock because it did actually work that way, but that's boring. Who wants to do that? The next option, of course, is getting another controller that's similar to the fardriver, where you have to do the wiring yourself and you have to do the tuning yourself, something like a Kelly controller or Flipski controller. Then the third option is to take it a step further and actually get something that is truly plug and play, something that is already tuned for me. I don't have to worry about that, and I know that it's gonna work. Something like Electro & Co.'s ETM kit. The only trouble with this one, of course, is that you're paying a premium, a big premium. But that's boring, and I'm me, of course, so I much rather buy a roller for half the price with an ETM already inside.